Hey everybody, I'm Zac.
And I'm Jesse.
And you're watching In Depth.
On Now You Know.
As always, we're sponsored by ecoware.us, where we carbon offset the production, shipping, and life cycle of every product, and we plant a tree for every order. So you can help support us here on Now You Know by heading over to EcoWare.
And we're brought to you by abetterrouteplanner.com. They have a new premium version of their app, which you can go try out for free using our referral code down below. And it has a ton of great features. So, you should definitely check it out.
And we're sponsored by our friends at the solar-powered hotels in Schaumburg, Illinois, the Fairfield Inn & Suites by Marriott and the Town Place Suites Hotel right next door. They're both connected and they're both solar-powered. All right, so I'd like to talk about something that we've talked about in the past couple Tesla Time newses. And this is our idea of, as we've been sitting here during this pandemic, thinking about what we'd like the world to look like as we leave and some takeaways, I'd like the world to realize that we've been planning our cities entirely wrong for like the past 100 years.
Absolutely. Right now, cities around the world are closing some of their streets to allow people to walk safely both from cars and for social distancing. And, if you've ever been to a big city, it's this big bustling place. And one of the reasons for all the bustle and the pushing and the shoving and the getting stuck walking behind a slow person is that you're walking on very narrow sidewalks. And that leads to a lot of problems, especially when you can't necessarily just pass by someone really closely.
Yeah, it's like sidewalks were an afterthought. Like people and pedestrians and bikes were just like, gosh, we have to have that in our city.
Absolutely.
I wanted trucks and taxis honking and cars and pollution.
But there is good news. Seattle is going to be permanently closing over 20 miles of streets to through traffic going forward. Now, the ideas that we're putting forth in this episode have come from everything that we've been experiencing up to this point, everything to do with EVs, e-bikes, and other general environmental initiatives. And we think that we have some very interesting things to discuss to improve the world. And for a long time, lots of people have been pushing for bike lanes in cities, and we agree with much of what is already out there, although we want to add this thought to what's already been said. And by looking at this crisis as an opportunity, we can start to make these positive changes. What are we proposing here?
Over the past few weeks, we've had this idea buzzing through our heads, and we've been talking about it a lot. Like, what if cities and towns permanently closed long streets to allow for bikers and pedestrians, as well as new classes of smaller electric vehicles? And normally, such an idea would be too ambitious and shot down with regards to traffic above all else. However, with this decrease in traffic and more attention to health, this could be the golden opportunity to adopt clean, open streets.
Now, when you bring up this topic to some people, they go, whoa, whoa, whoa. I want to keep the streets open for cars because as soon as you close down the city for cars, well, I can't even imagine a city without any cars because that's just the way it's always been. Every city ever has always had cars. And that is wrong on its face because obviously there's Mohenjo-Daro, Rome, all sorts of cities that didn't have cars because we just didn't have any cars.
Even New York City didn't start with cars.
Exactly. There were, there were carts and horses and stuff like that. But the idea here is that we don't need to change over every single street in the entire city to being devoid of cars and only for pedestrians and bikers. You could have a very relatively low number of streets devoted to this, probably maybe even 3, depending on, what kind of city you have and the geography. And the difference here is, they're usually in the center of a city in a downtownish area. You have an area that's typically pretty devoid of cars. It's very hustly bustly kind of thing. Great for people, but it's usually very hard to get there. So what we're proposing is to have more of a residential street. And another part of this topic is that it would allow for people to drive cars on the streets, but just people who lived on those streets. So you'd have a very, very strict speed limit, very, very slow, probably below 15 or 10 miles an hour. So just to get, this is the last mile to get you home. And the basic idea is that this would allow for more people to feel like they could bike or walk to where they need to go within a city without needing to get into their car because, as we've talked about in so many different areas, cars are the most expensive way to do a lot of different things.
And you might be saying, Zac and Jesse, you're never going to get people to go under 20 miles an hour. But we're planning for something that's going to take a while to build out. And by the time we build it out, we're probably going to have autonomous cars. And autonomous cars do whatever you tell them to do. So if they enter a zone that's, say, 15 miles an hour speed limit, That's what they'll do.
Right.
They will not go faster. And you won't have to worry about humans and reading signs and, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to go slower. That won't happen.
Right. And there's another reason that we're bringing this up now, as opposed to having brought it up years and years ago. We are seeing an explosion in micro e-mobility vehicles. So, everyone knows about bikes and, scooters are coming onto the scene as this, e-scooters, it's scooters for adults. That's new. But we're also talking about electric vehicles that can do more than just a bike, more than just a scooter.
Right, because I hear some of your objections. If you're in a city, you're like, there's a lot of stuff that has to get delivered in a city.
Right.
Not just people, but packages and mail and so forth. Well, these machines here can do that.
Right. We're talking about companies like Arcimoto. Very small footprint, very quiet, very friendly. You wouldn't want any of these vehicles to be gasoline powered or diesel powered because they would be too loud, they'd be too smelly. You wouldn't want them on your streets. These, however, because they are electric, currently there are companies making these, and the Arcimoto, for example, can go on a highway. It can go up to 75 miles an hour. But a lot of these smaller electric machines kind of got built with no place to put them.
Right.
And a promenade or a closed off street would be a perfect place for them to be.
It's a really good point. They can make their way from regular highways and streets to these smaller residential streets.
Right. Dropping off needed supplies. And another big thing that we haven't talked about is e-bikes.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people, when they hear bikes, unless you're a biker already, then you're like, well, I'm just not into bikes.
Right.
And
I don't really want to bike. I don't want to arrive at my destination all sweaty and have to strip off my spandex suit. Like, I would, no, biking's not for me.
E-bikes allows a whole new group of people to join the bike revolution because if, I'm not really built for biking, I'll be honest. I get pretty tired on a bike pretty quick. But e-bikes, I can go pretty much as long as you want, as long as I've got battery power.
Right.
And we've been going on, 10-mile bike rides without breaking a sweat.
Right. I mean, I remember every year we would go on one big bike ride. This was before we had e-bikes. And it was a huge pain because someone would ultimately go, I'm tired. I don't want to keep going. And then, this, what should have been a 15-mile bike ride, turns out to be a 7-mile bike ride, and we have to turn around and head back home. Or someone, it's not pleasant. Or if you were to ride it to work, that means that your work is going to need to have showers.
Right.
An e-bike changes all this. It means that no longer are hills such a big problem. No longer you huffing and puffing to get up just even a slight incline. You're just going to be gliding effortlessly up. You're still getting exercise, but also taking up way less space than a car.
And I mean, you could bring a little cargo with you. So if you have a job where you have to bring some bulky items, an e-bike allows you to do that really no problem.
Right. But there is a problem with this whole thing, this whole idea of, you close off the streets. It sounds great, but what's the point if you have to stop every single block? Because, I understand. Maybe you make it so that way you don't have to stop every block. But now cars can't get across what is now essentially almost like a river. Like, great, now you've just added another river in the middle of your city. And all the traffic planners and stuff are going to grumble and be like, wow, you can't, it's going to add a lot of traffic. So what are we going to do?
Because, I mean, my vision, I don't know about yours, but mine isn't to have this wonderful promenade where people can walk along with some e-bikes and then every block have to stop.
At a dangerous intersection.
At a dangerous intersection. Like, I don't want that. That's just, you get into it and then...
right, you have to stop.
No. So I want at least 3, 4, 5 blocks before you even have to encounter a car. But you're right. If you did that in most cities, you would then have blocked off the city to all of that traffic. So how are we going to solve that?
Tunnels.
Yeah. Boring tunnels. We do have occasional tunnels in a city. You'll have some kind of tunnel here or there, but generally...
Or an overpass or an underpass.
Right. But
all that kind of
generally
stuff.
They're thought of as so expensive and such a big deal to construct. We're talking years of construction, that no neighborhood wants to put up with that. No one wants to pay for it. And so I think it's been taken out of the planner's toolbox. They've basically been told, like, okay, you can do whatever you want, but not tunnels.
Stick to this 2-dimensional space that we have and just try and make it work, even though it's impossible to run two things directly into each other. You're going to need to stop and wait for others to cross.
As we're seeing right now in Las Vegas, where the Boring Company is building 2-mile-long tunnels for, less than $50 million. That's including the stations. It's really not that expensive once you have the right technology. And the Boring Company has come up with that technology. Now, what I'm kind of proposing here is that for the most part, we try and get the cars to go into tunnels, and these would be kind of like mini tunnels. And this would be the beginning of a longer term plan that we're going to talk about later in the episode. But the idea here is that when you get to that end of the block where you would have had to encounter cars, what if those cars disappeared into a 3 or 5 block tunnel so that you could just keep walking without encountering them?
Now, ultimately, I think Elon's plan for the future would involve basically all cars and fast forms of transportation going underground because, well, they're dangerous. You don't want anything that's out on the surface of the earth to be endangered by all sorts of things driving along. I think that, kind of everyone is familiar with this, whether it be a person who runs across the road or a deer or a moose or a dog or a cat. There's lots of creatures who just are going to walk out in front of you. Having it be underground is going to be a lot safer.
So I have a vision which is broadly this: dedicated avenues, promenades, like here in Burlington, Vermont, or in Santa Monica, where walking people have the priority. There's still automobile streets interspersed, but there are swaths dedicated to pedestrians and e-bikes with trees and plants. And that's an important part here too, is that many cities are devoid of any kind of trees and plants because if you try and plant a tree in the middle of Manhattan, it doesn't get enough sun.
Right. And I mean, that's not to discredit, Central Park and places that, have been carved out of cities for green space. It's great to have Central Park, and it runs many, many, many blocks.
Well, and that is what we're talking about. They planned Central Park into New York. That was always planned to be there. It wasn't like they had to cut it out later. That is what makes New York, New York. Mm-hmm. What we're talking about now is that we have to start planning for the next step. So I'm proposing that we bring this to the next level, that we integrate bi-directional boring tunnels as a way to minimize the interaction between pedestrians and automobiles. So picture this. So when you get to the end of that block, either the pedestrians go down into an underground tunnel for a block or two so that they don't have to come into contact with cars, or the cars go down into a tunnel, one or the other. My priority would be to put the cars down below and the people get to stay above, but whatever works for the city.
And I mean, there are options where you could have the pedestrian path kind of flow over top of the road. There's many different options. It's just a matter of deciding that we're going to be closing roads because right now there are many cities that are doing so just for the safety of their citizens that now need to go out and walk and can't necessarily go to a park or a crowded beach.
So right now around the world, we have cities and states and countries that are all proposing different plans so that they can be carbon neutral by 2030 or 2040 or 2050. And these plans all have different phases, because they're not going to just wait till 2040 and then flick a switch and then be carbon neutral. They have to do things in between, right? Every year they have to do things to get them more and more towards that goal. So why not do the same kind of phased preparation towards a goal with cities? So my proposal is that each city should have a goal to be pedestrian friendly by whatever date they choose, let's say 2040. And with that goal in mind, each city should start planning for different phases to get them to that goal. So now phase 1 might be to do what Seattle or New York City is doing right now, which is closing certain streets to through traffic and rerouting so that certain residential neighborhoods have walking and bike-friendly streets running through them. That's pretty easy to do. Phase 2 might be to replan some paths through the city for cars, but not at the expense of walking and biking people. So what does this look like? Using this new tool in our tool chest, the bi-directional boring tunnel, we can start to plan where those tunnels should go, and we can start to plan their most effective use throughout the town. And so either use the tunnels to drop the pedestrians and bikes below the cars, or to drop the cars below the pedestrians. Either way, you've now minimized that interaction between the cars and the people. Now, the problem is you're probably at this point having a hard time imagining what I'm talking about, because this largely doesn't exist today. I mean, sure, there's little pockets of pedestrian-friendly areas, but not whole cities where cars have their way of getting around and people have their way of getting around.
And in fact, we tried to show you what this would look like. We opened the game City Skylines, which allows you to plan your future city, and we tried to create this. However, without extensive mods, there's no way to really make what we're talking about. The game is so ingrained with streets and cars that it doesn't lend itself well to trying to plan this pedestrian-friendly city because the fabric of a city has been so altered by the automobile.
Yeah, I mean, Jesse and I started playing SimCity back in the day when you were a kid, and we've evolved to, City Skylines, which is awesome. It has a lot of cool tools and a lot of cool mods. The problem is, you're right. It always seems like the goal in these cities is to, make it bigger, more people,
skyscrapers, industry.
Exactly. And it's very hard to find metrics in the game that we want to measure, like healthiness, happiness,
right?
The ability to get around the city in a fun, friendly, safe way.
Because plopping down a hospital doesn't make everyone who lives next to the hospital healthier. It means that, if they have an emergency, they can get to the hospital quicker. That's the positive. But it doesn't mean that people are going to stop coughing. It doesn't mean that people are not going to have other health issues just by living next to a hospital. That's not how hospitals work. But for the sake of the game, and I think for the sake of a lot of city planners, that idea hasn't been fully addressed.
And I just want to say how dangerous this is, because that means that decades of children who are going to really cool games like this to start letting their imagination run wild have been able to build amazing cities. We've seen some really cool ones, but they all are focused on the car. Almost by and large, it's hard to win this game or do well in this game without the car being the central focus. And so you've just been training decades of children and then decades of older people, older children.
Well, and it's not the game's fault. They mirror reality. We had, we basically, the car came in and the oil lobby and many other places just completely bulldozed whatever they needed to do. They completely split neighborhoods with highways. This is not new stuff that we're talking about. So this is kind of an idea that we're discussing here, which is kind of the antithesis of that. Instead of having to bulldoze down entire neighborhoods or split neighborhoods apart, we're actually going to be connecting them and creating a more cohesive city, one that you could actually safely and comfortably walk or bike.
And I mean, the problem is that for decades, we've been doing this to our societies around the world, and this has led to huge changes in all of our cultures. Now, when we go to eat, a lot of times it involves a drive-through. It means that you get in the car, you pick up some fast food from a place, you maybe eat it in the car, and then you go on to your destination. We've minimized the desire for a leisurely lunch or dinner, right, with friends and family. We've just crushed it down into a time-saving, get it in my face, do it as quick as possible, as cheap as possible thing. And that's largely because of the car. Now, there's a huge benefit to what we're talking about doing. When you get more people out and about, walking, biking, there's going to be this social benefit, this health benefit that is very hard for us to put numbers on. It's very hard for us to be like, well, it'll benefit you by 10,000 basis points. I can't put a number on it because there's really no scientific study that's taken like a New York and done, a side by side.
Right.
But we can find little glimpses of what we're talking about here. The first glimpse here is this, Church Street in Burlington, Vermont.
Right. This was made back in 1981, like fully and officially. And the whole concept of it was it's kind of like an outdoor mall. And so it has a lot of the benefits that we're talking about, but it is too short.
Right. So just picture this. Back in 1971, this street you're looking at with people on it was a car street. There was sidewalks, but it was meant for cars. And then in 1971, for one day, the residents and the businesses on that street said, hey, let's just try for one day. We'll shut down the street and we'll see what happens.
And we'll have a fair. They had a street fair.
And 15,000 people showed up and enjoyed the fair.
Right. Then the next year they had a week-long fair. It was also successful. And then the wheels started to get turning in motion.
So it took 10 years from 1971 when the first one day off from cars took place to 1981 when they finally closed it down. No cars are allowed on it. And so you've got this few blocks in Burlington, which I think if anyone's been to Burlington, Vermont, this is where you want to head. It's like the center of fun activity in the city.
And a similar concept is the Santa Monica Promenade. Very similar concept, all sorts of shops and stuff lining the street. You have lots and lots of space for people to walk around. There's lots of green space. It's very nice. But again, not particularly long, not particularly useful to get around Santa Monica or Los Angeles as a whole.
Right. Every couple blocks, you're stopping for cars. And this isn't anything new. If we look at the Back Bay in Boston, Commonwealth Avenue was modeled after Paris, where it's a wide boulevard and they put just, trees and parks down the middle of Com Ave. And that goes for blocks and blocks and blocks. But the problem is that, again, every block, Arlington, Berkeley, Clarendon, Dartmouth, you're going to hit a street with cars passing. And so you're going to have to stop and wait for the cars.
But it's still a very positive thing because it connects all of Back Bay to Boston itself. And I think that even though it's not perfect, it's a very, very, very positive example of what we're talking about.
Right. I mean, it's one of the most sought after streets in the city, and that's why the housing prices on that street are astronomical. And this is what it was built after, the Champs-Élysées in Paris, which is this wonderfully designed. They designed the city from the beginning to have wide boulevards. And yes, there are cars going down the main streets there, but look at how wide the sidewalks are. That leaves a lot of room for trees, and there's so much width to the street. And because the buildings are set at a maximum height, there's enough sunshine on those streets for the trees and plants. So you get this nice mix of...
And the humans. Enough sunshine for humans, too. That's important.
Right. And so you have room for cafes. And I mean, that's what Paris is known for, right? That you can sit outside a shop and have a cup of coffee. Something that's really hard to do, let's say, in New York City. Hard to find a place where you have the room to do that. And so Seattle took that idea and they're going with it with what they're calling their Healthy Streets program. And so they've first started with this phase 1, which is to basically just shut down some streets for certain times so that families can get out and about pretty safely. Now, it's not shut to all cars. If you live on the street or if it's a garbage truck or emergency vehicle, they have access to these streets. But by and large, it's a whole lot safer than it was before.
Right. And I want to point out that this is a pretty easy thing to do. It's not permanent. They're not installing bollards. They're not ripping up the road and planting, a forest. They are just closing the roads for however long they want to do it. And it's not too hard to get a city or a town to implement something like this. You simply close down the two ends of the street, and you can do it for particular times of day. For example, some places, they close down streets between 8 in the morning and 8 at night. So that way, during nighttime, if people need to zip back and forth, they can. That's not typically when you really want to be outside in a city.
Right. I mean, when we were in Portland, Oregon, many of the neighborhoods have been slightly redesigned to have these roundabouts in the middle of them, very small roundabouts, which for a car really slows you down. There's no way to go around it without just going to a crawl. But that's great for the residential neighborhood because that means that no car is ever really going to get up to any kind of speed.
And they don't want to go through that neighborhood in order to shave a few minutes off of their commute because they know that they're just going to be slowed down. So there are many different examples and many different ways that we can try to adopt this type of strategy in a city. And it doesn't have to be, my way or the highway or any type of it has to be perfect or it's useless. Any little improvement that you make in a city is going to make a huge, huge, huge improvement. But what I think we need to be talking about is that right now is the time to do it. Right now, you're going to have the political will to want to do that. And right now, there's a whole bunch of new technologies that are going to make it easier. I want to talk a little bit more about tunnels for a minute, because when we're talking about these micro mobility, small devices that can zip along through tunnels, we could really have long distance tunnels that have exits that would, pop up from place to place that could alleviate traffic in many different places. And I know that Elon's talking about this for full-size cars, but you could have bi-directional micro-mobility tunnels. It wouldn't be that hard, and it would be pretty safe, because if you had a maximum speed of 30 miles an hour in the tunnel, not having to stop every block, that's going to speed you up a lot.
And it would be a lot cheaper. I mean, building one tunnel that can handle 2 sets of traffic is half as much as building 2 tunnels.
And I just want to point out the only reason we're talking about tunnels at all is because Elon has been working on the Boring Company and working on getting the price of tunnels down to a level that is not so ridiculously outrageous to what we've been talking about previously, where basically the only time it would ever make sense to dig a tunnel was if you were going to have a massive subway system with massive amounts of people traveling through it.
And I want to talk about expensive for a second, because I bet many of you right now are now muttering under your breath, this will be expensive. And it will. But let's put it in perspective. Infrastructure is expensive no matter what you're building it for, whether it's bridges, tunnels, and roads for cars, or whether it's bridges, tunnels, and roads for people. Infrastructure costs a lot of money. Our governments are spending a lot of money right now, and we're not getting a whole lot for it. It's just to basically keep everyone going. But when we spend money on infrastructure that reduces traffic and gets more people active and helps clean up the air, that's money that's well spent. So this goes back to not being able to measure something. When you say, well, this tunnel's going to cost $1 million, that's a lot of money. What if it reduces traffic by 50%? In a city? What if it means that people can get where they're going a whole lot faster? There's not an easy way to measure the value of that.
Right, because let's talk about some of the benefits. A, you could be taking cars off the road. If people have a viable way to bike to work, and they're going to say, I could own a car, which involves me buying a car, insuring it, parking it in a city, and having to deal with all the other hassle of owning a vehicle. Or I could own a bike, which I just bring up into my apartment or my house, and then I can bike to work, lock it up outside, and bike at home, or an e-bike, it completely changes the game. You say, oh, I don't need a car. So now you just took a car off the road, which helps with traffic. You took a car off the road, which helps with emissions, pollution, and carbon dioxide. And you have someone who's now healthy, biking to and from work, and it changes your economy because as that person is biking to and from work, much easier to stop on a bike and be like, oh, I'm going to go check out that store. Oh, I'm going to go to this cafe and get myself a coffee. Instead of having to go to the chain drive-through off of the highway exit, this person is able to go, oh, I think I'll take a different route home from work today, or I will go visit my friend because parking a bike is not as difficult as parking a car.
And let's talk about mental health. When you're in a city where you're just driving in your metal box right through the city and not, just beeping at people because they're annoying to you, how does that leave you at the end of your drive? We all know, I know how I feel at the end of that drive. I'm just irritated.
Right.
But if you bike through a city or if you walk through a city and you're bumping into people.
Right. But I mean, especially now if we're talking about a city that has this bike lane where it's going to be enjoyable for you to get out.
Right. Well, what I'm saying is you're walking along and you're getting to see people that you know and you see them all the time. That creates a sense of community, and that is something that is invaluable. You can't put a price tag on that. Getting to feel like you belong in a community is exactly what we're all looking for.
Right. And this concept doesn't have to be applied to an extraordinarily dense city, okay? Because right now you might be picturing New York and you might be saying like, hey, there's no room to do it in New York. But the reason people move to New York is because you don't need to own a car because everything is so densely packed around you that you can walk to it. But that has all of the negative impacts that we've been seeing in the past couple months, as well as all of the other negative things that happen when you live so densely packed in New York, in terms of rents being super expensive, in terms of it just being dirty and a filthy place to live.
Well, and as you talked about before, if you can take a car off the road, we have to find a space for that car in New York. So it's a parking lot or a garage for that car. That car doesn't have feelings. That car is not a person,
right?
But we have to pay for that car to live.
Right.
You get that car out of there, there's more space for people.
Right. And I mean, I want to point to like the Brooklyn Bridge. You have this big, long pedestrian and bike path stretching across the water that allows people to bike into New York City, this densely packed place. It's such a positive impact in terms of the number of people that can travel on a bike or on their 2 feet across this bridge every day, as opposed to needing to take a car. And now you could be arguing for public transportation. However, public transportation at the moment is not a particularly positive conversation that people want to be having because no one wants to take public transportation at the moment for obvious reasons.
And yeah, I mean, if you've been to New York anytime in the past few years, the Green Line, which is a converted, but used to be basically a train route, is now a people route. And it's like packed with people now because it's so much fun. People want to be walking through the city. It's just there's really wasn't any designated space for it. So rail trails have become this new thing because when you had a railway line that has gone through a place and then you now gotten rid of that railway line, you have a dedicated path that's perfect for people, not big enough for cars. And so throughout America, we're finding these rail trails popping up that allow you to get through communities safely and fun and very inexpensively. And this is what I'm talking about. These weren't planned, but we got to use the fact that rails had been there before. And so it's just kind of like a makeshift plan. Right. I'm talking about really planning going forward.
And this is where we find ourselves at this crossroads where we're able to actually close roads. Normally, if you ever propose, I think that we should close this street, you just get a ton of yeah, it's going to be traffic. What are you thinking? You can't do that. There needs to be cars. You need parking. What about this? What about that? But if we can actually implement a big scale project, and I'm talking any sized city or town, I think that there are many towns. We've been experiencing this. We live in a fairly small-ish town, and traffic has been so low in our town, and people have been needing to get outside so badly that people have kind of taken over the streets.
Right.
Everyone has been driving slower, I've noticed, because every, quarter mile, you're running into someone who's walking in the middle of the street because we don't have any sidewalks.
Right.
And all we need to do is identify either a loop in our town or a connecting, set of streets that could connect to another town's, set of streets that could get us all the way into one of the larger cities around us.
Well, and this is a really key point that you're bringing up, which is right now it seems crazy, right, to close off streets. I'm hearing you right now. Town planners are like, okay, so the police are going to have to bring barricades, blah, blah, blah. Yes, that would be very hard, except for this one thing that's coming. autonomy.
Yeah.
Autonomy is coming. And that's the first thing I want you to do is get that into your head. It is coming. There's no way around it. Now, you might be like, it's 50 or 100 years off. No, it's not. It's here a lot sooner than you think. And when autonomy happens, these street closures that Jesse's talking about can happen automatically.
Right.
It's software.
Nothing needs to block the street. Nothing needs to, there don't need to be any signs posted anywhere of what the new speed limit is. You can just instantly, few lines of code. Okay, these streets are now pedestrian and bike only.
Right.
And if you live on those streets, you could have it so that your autonomous vehicle will drive very slowly and avoid pedestrians all the way to your destination very slowly. Or it can be that they simply aren't allowed on the street. They'll let you off at the intersection and you can walk down to your house. It wouldn't be that hard, and you could have it be configurable for any day of the week. You could say, oh, Thursdays, Chestnut Street is open.
Right.
But on Fridays, it's closed, and they have a street fair. We're not even starting to take a look at any of the positive benefits. Like, for example, farmers markets. It's really hard to implement a farmer's market. You need to find a space to have it. It needs to be either like a parking lot or a town common. And then there's all sorts of questions about traffic and stuff like that. And then usually it's only once a week.
Right.
If, for example, you could have a farmer's market that would be in different places all throughout the week, the farmers would love it because they would have new places to bring their produce to sell.
Exactly.
And people would love it because they wouldn't have to travel halfway across town to go to the farmer's market once a week along with everyone else.
Some of my best memories growing up in the city in Boston were street fairs where we would close down the streets and it was just like this whole new area. Like the city was different all of a sudden.
Right.
And it's just because you're getting to walk in the street safely. And so then you can have vendors and music. That's what I would like to see again. I would like to see this resurgence of getting the people back out into the cities instead of making them feel like, oh, I have to be careful of cars all the time.
Right. And we know that there is a change that's happened because bike sales have gone through the roof in the past few months for obvious reasons. And what I think that that's going to lead to is I think that a lot of people are getting on their bikes and they're loving it. They're loving having no traffic. And when stuff starts to go back and you're not going to be able to ride your bike, I think a lot of people are going to be bummed. And all it takes right now is to begin these conversations, whether it be at a town hall or start your own little committee, start your own little group.
But the key here is these two new tools that are in your toolbox, town planners, that you probably don't know you have.
Right.
Tunnels and autonomy. And I know it's going to be tough in the beginning because this barely exists anywhere. It's going to be hard to point to. You can point to places like Las Vegas where they're actually building the tunnels right now. And I urge you, when they're built in January, to get out there and go experience them and take pictures and videos so you can show the world that this actually, it happened on budget, on time, and it was cheaper than anyone thought it could be. And then with autonomy, hop in a Tesla and see what they can do already. It's amazing. You get on the highway and then it can take an exit all by itself, slow down. That's amazing.
Right. And I would just say push your local governments to begin closing roads and just experimenting what that's like. Even if that road ends up never being closed ever again for any reason, doesn't matter. Have that experience. Close down a residential street, one that's at least a mile long, I would say, and just see what it's like. Have everyone walk the street and just be like, oh, this is actually kind of nice.
Yeah.
I know that there are some places that are very walkable. So I'm not pointing to everywhere, maybe where you live and being like, you might be like, what are you talking about? I can go for lots of lovely walks. But I know that there's lots of places in the world where this simply has never existed. And now is the time that we get to change it.
When I was growing up on my street, there was parking on one side of the street. And so the street felt completely different. You could go out and play in the street as a kid. And then I woke up one morning and there was parking on both sides of the street. And it felt, you could barely put a car down the middle of the street now because there's parking on both sides. So now it just felt, it lost all of its character. Now I know people must have been happy. There's more places to put their cars. But think what just happened. You just made it twice as easy to park a car, which meant more people like, oh, I can buy a car now, which just added to the problem.
Right.
You took away all that space. You made the street less livable. And that's what they're doing in cities, is they're just making it so where can we find space for cars? And that's the wrong direction to be going.
Right. I mean, I remember the big dig that happened in Boston. That was an absolute cluster. But this greenway, they're supposed to get, it's going to be great. This greenway is going to connect, the north end to Boston itself. And it's just a ton of just, if you want to get anywhere on the Greenway, you have to cross at least 2 very busy, very scary intersections. And so it completely defeats the purpose. You hardly ever see like a large number of people there unless it's an absolutely perfect, beautiful day.
That's really funny because the whole point, like the whole way they sold it to us was this whole Greenway. But in fact, before, when it was an elevated highway, even though that was awful too, at least when you wanted to get from the north end to the west end, you could just walk under the highway.
Right.
But then, you know, years of construction, and when they did finally do the tunnel, they did it wrong. And that's what I'm saying here is don't do it for the car.
Right.
Do it for the people. Make sure that people are put first.
Right.
And that's how the project should be structured.
Right. And I think that it's going to bring prosperity. I think that that these areas are going to become more valuable.
Oh, yeah.
Because you've just increased their value by a lot by having this really nice resource. And I think that it's also, you're opening up avenues for people to go biking. So think of it as like a little bike highway.
Yeah.
How are we going to get the bikes into the city? That's what you should be thinking.
Yeah.
So we hope you enjoyed this in depth. We hope that it's something interesting to think about. Talk about it with your family. Talk about it with your friends. This is an interesting concept. And now is the time to do something. If you're sitting at home right now and you're like, oh, I don't have anything to do. Geez, this sucks. It's a perfect time to start engaging with your government.
Or becoming part of the government.
Absolutely.
Run for office. Get out there. Oh, and you know what? Before I forget, what I'd like you guys to do at home, since you probably got a little time on your hands, is work with us on this. Envision this. What would you like the future of your city to look like? Send us some drawings. Send us some city skyline pictures. However you'd like to do it. Like maybe it's toilet paper rolls. However you'd like to show it.
Take a screenshot of Google Maps, whatever you want to show, or whatever your idea is. We'd love to see it because it's through the sharing of these ideas that we're going to come up with even better ideas.
Yeah, we'll put it on the show on Tesla Time News. So send them to Zac@nowyouknowchannel.com or on our Facebook or wherever you can find us. Thanks so much for watching. Now you know.